this chapter in particular is asking that kind of question, the very title, how does race shape the lives of white people? How is it that we sit in a space where we are able to take easy routes instead of having to do challenging routes? And so I want you to start off today by telling me about some of those challenges. And I'll begin because I had one this week. I had a very good friend of mine who called me up, and it's because he was being sent to Portland. He's a Border Patrol agent. And so he wasn't getting sent there for a reason that I really liked. But he was calling me in a pastoral role saying, my wife is having a hard time with this deployment. Can you help us through this? And I wanted to say, Ben, let me fix you going there, but had to be silent about that because I was in a different role. And it's been bugging me since. How should I speak in moments like that? I think I made the right choices, but it wasn't because it was holistically the best choice either. Where is it through your life that you can look back and say, I wish I could have made, or I wish I had made a different choice than what I had? Where was it that you were benefiting from racism, and so you didn't say anything? How was it that you were not courageous enough to speak out? Where is it that the benefits of race allowed you to make one choice versus another?
Nothing's coming to my mind.
This is Kristen, and I was just thinking everything I have is an advantage.
Absolutely. We forget that we have an awful lot of benefits, and maybe more importantly, not that we have the benefits, but that others lack those same benefits, right? That they don't have to face this, that they don't get to face life with those things in place.
Well, and also that we assume that they do.
We do assume that they do, don't we?
Yeah.
Because I can walk down this street easily, talking about like where Wendy was out early, talking about women in America. I've realized that my wife feels less comfortable in going into some of the same places that I go into very easily. Partially that's personality, but partially it also is gender. And am I aware of that? And how am I aware of that racially?
You know, it's amazing how much I just turn my brain off. As I live life, I go through life thinking about myself, my family, my friends, things I need to do. And the whole surrounding all that is all this stuff going on in which I'm unconscious of.
Yes. Yeah.
And I say things that I'm unconscious of, and I do things and I don't think clearly about them, and maybe what I'm doing is not particularly helpful to someone else's well-being or just well-being. And you know, it's hard to remember. It's hard to stay aware.
All right. I was very appreciative, for example, of the book that Joni read on Sunday, with a very strong African-American lead in that book, because when I was teaching, there weren't as many books that way. And so in a very, very real way, we were teaching a white frame white point of view, because we didn't have or didn't easily search out all of that. And so we just assumed that all those kids of color were getting an appropriate education, which wasn't reflecting who they were or what they were emerging out of.
Yeah.
What else? How else have you, shall we say, failed in the past and become
Jim?
aware of it? Yes.
This is Dixie. I have to say, shamefully, sadly, as a teacher, I taught in Idaho, and I was in a school where there was probably a third of the school was Mexican, and I had Mexican coworkers and teachers. But what I saw, and I did not comment or intervene, was my coworker, my co-teacher, who was Mexican, who was basically drummed out of her position because the principal wanted her white friend to have her job.
Uh-huh.
And it was horrible. And I think back on it, and I don't think I realized how much I abdicated my power, by not saying anything or doing anything. I was going to retire. It would have cost me nothing. And as I think back on it now, and I think that it was absolutely scandalous. And it was just nothing but a railroad job. It was nepotism with a racial tinge. And this teacher was fabulous. She was great, but she was told even by her peers, "Oh, don't rock the boat. Just take it. They'll drum you out." And I thought, I could have spoken up. And I think that that's something that I didn't even realize that I was here thinking about it. How shameful that is that I could have made a difference to this teacher.
But that type of space is almost endemic from our past. It was very easy for us to not speak up. It was almost understood that we wouldn't. And that at least is part of where we're at, is to try to say, how do we step into a space that's better? I love the James Baldwin quote that was in here. James Baldwin, marvelous voice if you haven't read much of his stuff. But he said, I don't know if white Christians hate Negroes or not, but I know that we have a Christian church that is white and a Christian church which is black. And I know that the most segregated hour in American life is high noon on Sunday.
Wow.
Right? And it goes through a bunch of other things. I don't know whether or not the labor unions are biased, but, right? And he began to, and essentially he's asking us to question, why is it that all this is here? Because most of our life, we haven't had to, right? It's easier for us not to have to.
We didn't have any other models.
Go ahead.
We had no other models.
We had no other models. But it really is saying, at whose expense do we get to enjoy our relative ease? And I'm going to tell you my bottom line. It's not because I want whites to be dragged down to this level. It's that we have to work hard to help others to rise to, if this is what I want to expect for my children, how do we help that to be the expectation for all children? If this is what I want for myself, how do I have that expectation for everyone around me? And that I don't get this at someone else's expense. And she showed lots of examples about that. I was struck by the one that said, all places I perceive as beautiful are open to me racially. But are they to someone else?
Yeah.
Can I walk boldly through life where someone else has to walk carefully in that same space?
That point that you just made, Jim, about rising up to the level puts more into my thinking about that beautiful song of Rise Up and what's underneath that song that I hadn't really been thinking about. So thank you for that.
Yeah. I think that we have to be very careful. There's a lot of people that say, you're trying to drag me down. No, we don't want to do that. We don't want to do that. We just want to truly say, if this is what you need, if this is what you think you're deserving of, then who is not? Let's rise up, like you said.
I don't know if this is Dixie again. I don't know if anybody saw, but it was interesting, and I wanted to get the group's perspective. On MSNBC, they had a professor who challenged this book, a Black professor who said that he felt like that the book infantilized Black people, and it was written from a perspective of a woman who was saying that white people, you have to take care of the Black brother, you know. And it was a really interesting perspective.
Yeah.
And the writer didn't come on, but a Black man who wrote the preface did come on, and I've forgotten his name. But it was kind of interesting, you know, that he felt like her motives were right, the author of the book, but he didn't feel like that it was, you know, that it was effective and that it was an insult to the Black community. I thought that was very interesting. I've got to stop and sit and think on that for a while. But
it was an interesting interview. If you didn't see it was maybe 2 days ago or something that came on about that. I found much of his arguments very disingenuous personally. But as we move further along, he mentioned specifically towards the end of the book, I want to say chapter 7, 8, something like that. And so let's be careful and make sure that that is not essentially belittling part of us, right? Let's make sure that it is, that what we're talking about is always a lifting of all of us. Okay? Because it should never be that somebody has to be humbled in order to have someone else rise, but that we can all rise together. But that's what we're truly wanting to bring up. So if you get a chance, watch that.
Yeah, that was actually, it sounds like from a article written in the Atlantic, which I read, which I thought was very interesting commentary about the book, and very interesting observation about it. Yeah, if anybody wants the link, I'm happy to send it.
Good.
I'd like to have it.
Yeah, if you can click it, put it into, I mean, if you can paste it into the chat box, that would be great. And it was,
I don't think I can. I'd have to go on my computer and do it with the email.
Okay.
And I'm on my iPad right now, so.
Okay, so when I send out, there's gonna be some things that I'm gonna send out, and when I do that, just reply back to everyone and
Okay, yeah.
Thank you, Sarah.
Yeah.
Who wrote the article? Who wrote the article? Do we know?
It was a Black professor, and I don't remember his name. I read it a few days ago.
Okay.
But yeah, it was very interesting what he had to say about it, and some of the things I have to say I've had some concerns in a way as I've listened to the audiobook, and the audiobook is different than reading it in print, and so yeah, so it was very interesting to hear a different point of view and from somebody who's African American.
Thanks.
I think we're missing the point here that not all Blacks are going to have the same viewpoint. It's like,
Yeah.
it's like, give up. Really? That's like saying, well, every Black person ought to agree with everything. That's just not, I mean, there's Black or Trump. It's like, that's just not, I don't find that a valid argument in the least.
But this was written by a white woman.
Right, well, but.
Yeah, who also has done a lot of research and worked her. I mean, right. I'm sorry, I listened to an interview on Being with Krista Tippett with her and another Black man, and it's like it's like, I guess I'm trying to figure out what you're trying to tell her, because people don't like it, or because she's white. And it's like, to me, what she's saying is whites have to take care of whites' racism. And it's not be teaching us, it's we need to teach each other. And this guy, I forget his name right now. He wrote the book, My Grandmother's Hands, about how racism actually affects the Black person's body. And slavery, and how it's like, it's affected I mean, and he said, I fear progressive white Christians and progressive white more than I do racist whites, because because I know where I stand with somebody who's a white supremacist. He said, you know, he's talking about as soon as it becomes uncomfortable for white America, they can drop the issue right off. It's like there's nothing there. Okay. It's like you can drop it and say, okay, it's too hot for me now. I'm going to back off. But if you're black, you don't have that option.
Yeah.
And you cannot say, well, I'm tired of this. This is making me weary. I think I'm going to get away from it for a while. You walk out your front door and it's part of your life. It's ingrained in your sweat. It's part of your very being. You walk out your door and it's like, I have a friend who has a 17-year-old black son who's like 6'2", and the conversation she has to have with her son are conversations white mothers do not have to have with their white teenage sons. And, you know, it's like just walking, the fact that there's a black man, I mean, there's so many stories of, it's like, don't discount what she's saying, because whites have to help whites with this. This is not a black helping white issue. We've got to.
Oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry, it's just my little bandbox there. I'll shut up now.
Well, it sounds though like that professor was saying that her treatment of the subject was condescending. And so I think the challenge to us is to like check that out. Do we see that? Do we feel that?
Yeah.
Right.
Because here's the thing, this book does not have to be a perfect book for us to learn from it. And there are undoubtedly flaws in it and things that could be taken too far to one extreme or another. Although, of course, we as human beings never take things to extreme. But the question is are we using it as a way to be able to open us and challenge us and move us out of that lethargy which so often has marked white America in these issues, that we haven't allowed the discomfort to move us to better spaces, because it is discomforting, isn't it? These conversations are not simple. There's not easy solutions, and yet we need to move towards it. I watched a movie the other day which tried to delve into this, and starts off with a black woman in a police headquarters yelling at the officer that was attending her because her son is somewhere in custody, right? And then white father comes in later on, and the struggle of those two, mixed race marriage, trying to figure out what to do about their son, and he's 18, and it's a really interesting movie, and it left me unsettled because there's not simple answers to it.
That was a great.
That's the same thing with what we're dealing with. There's not simple answers, and what will work in Kentucky for a 17-year-old black man may not work in New York for an 18-year-old black woman. And we have to figure out how to be present as we can in the situations of our lives.
I guess
Did anyone notice? Oh, go ahead, Judy.
My thing was just not to discount the book because there's criticism. I agree with Jim.
No.
You know, do you just discount the book because you don't like her, because she may be condescending? It's like, it's easy as a white person to look for flaws in her arguments, because then that lets us off the hook.
Yeah.
And it's like, I'm sorry, it's not, it's like, I guess I'm at the point right now where I sent a message to Jim not too long ago. It's not enough to not be racist. We have to be anti-racist. And that takes energy, it takes thought, it takes stamina, it takes a willingness to really educate ourselves, to dig deep into very uncomfortable parts of ourselves. Yeah. And if you want to lift everyone up, how much are we willing to sacrifice to do that? As far as, are we willing to have more taxes so we can get are we willing to take away from the defense budget so that we can get, and it's like, what are we what are we going to fight for to make that happen? Because it's not just race, it's also class.
Yeah. In fact, Ibram Kendi, who wrote the book that word comes out of, the book about anti-racism, how to be an anti-racist, he would say that there is no such thing as non-racist, that is an impossible space. The two opposites are racist or anti-racist. And so you can choose how to sit in that space, but you cannot be non-racist. And if we do another study after this, that's the book I'd really like us to delve into and say, how do we work? But we can already begin to ask that type of question. How is it in the midst of what life gives to us and how race has already shaped us from the very beginning of our lives to today? How do we choose to not allow that shaping to continue to happen, but to see things differently than that, and to act differently than just that?
The author, though, says that we never can be non-racist, that we are on a continuum, and that hopefully we can progress along that continuum.
Yeah.
But because of the socialization, as she calls it, there is no way that we cannot be non-racist.
Yeah, and I loved that. Thank you, Margaret. That was such a good image for me to be able to say, not am I here or here, because and we'll get more into this when we get to chapter 5, where it talks about the good bad binary. And I've learned that dualism, putting things into sets of two, is really a negative way of being able to use the world. It's simple, but it's a terrible way to group things. And that idea of continuum and how we're moving rather than where we're sitting is much more important for us to be good at it. Thank you.
And I think we all really needed this book to open our eyes to how much our systems are racist.
That's right.
And I love her examples of the meetings she went to at these businesses and what white people would say.
Yep.
And there were only 2 black people sitting there, and the one guy says, well, a white person can't get a job anymore.
Yep. Because many of those things we found are very, they're just so endemic in our society that we don't even think about it. And what I think one of the major points that she's saying in all of this is we have to. We have to choose to think about it. The one line that was very challenging to me is where she said, my silence is not benign.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, right.
I like that she shares her own experiences with it, like about the vacation to Lake Cardoline and how it, in Idaho would be for her versus how it would be for her coworker.
Yeah. And I love that she's saying essentially that's when she was awakened one more time. And part of what my first question was about is, where are those places where you have been awakened in one way or another? In your consciousness, you've had to think about it differently. And the more we're aware of that, so that as we face the next space that might also challenge us, maybe we make a different decision. The people why I found the one author a little disingenuous is because it felt too much like it was just an argument against, because he was supposed to. I think it's always bad for us to just be against. It's good for us to thoughtfully be against.
Yeah, this is Dixie again. I didn't bring it up because I agreed with it. I just thought that it was an interesting perspective, but I too felt like it was a bit like people that criticize a movie, where a black actor wins an award, and then it's like, I agree with you, Jim. It was an odd argument.
Yeah.
But again, I wasn't bringing it up because I felt criticism of the author. I really think the book's important, and but it just, anyway, like I said, that wasn't the reason I brought it up, because I don't agree with him.
Yeah. But that's what we have to do, is be in that conversation. You know, I have a friend of mine who basically said, that's a horrible book, and that's why I'm all against it. And I said, have you read it? No, he read whatever someone had said.
Yeah.
I'm more of the mind of what Paul said in the New Testament: try all things and hold fast to that which is true. I don't think God draws the hard lines that we often draw. That's a binary type of thing. God invites us in, and then invites us to find what is truly edifying and enriching to not just myself, but to us as a society. I think that's what the divine presence is trying to do, is draw us to best possible society. And at least part of what this moment is saying is that our relationships, white relationships to Black America, are not the best possible society.
Well, and another thing we have to think about is the polarization between our political parties.
Absolutely.
One political party thinks the other is just totally this way. We think they're totally the other way, you know, when that's not the case.
It is not. And how are we in conversation, and what is going on? Going back to Portland, where my friend Ben is at, I have somebody else who was cheering about that, and I said, okay, so you're not believing in the Constitution, because I thought you were one who was really liking the Constitution. And Constitution gives the president no powers to be able to do that, right? To bring in federal troops without permission. And unless we can be in that kind of conversation, we're going to miss it. And too often in the racial areas, for white America, it has been a silencing of those conversations because it's easier. And we have got to be bold in not letting that be true. It's simple, but as she pointed out, we like to position ourselves as innocent of race, and we're not. Race is part of who we are, part of how we have lived our whole lives. And unless we acknowledge that and live as if it is true, then we're truly not going to be in an honest space in our society, and definitely not in the best possible society we can be. Go ahead.
One of the things that's I've been, because I've had a lot of time on my hands, I've actually almost finished the book now. And I think that one of the things that's been the hardest for me, and this was brought up to me by my daughter as well when I was working with the YWCA program in Mankato, that my feelings are really not acceptable as far as the Blacks are concerned. I mean, my feelings over the last few months that I've been reading a lot, Just Mercy was one of the things that I read, which was really impactful to me. And I cried and cried and cried. And she said, Mom, white women's tears are not acceptable. They don't want your tears. And so I've been trying to figure out why did I react this way? Was it, I mean, in her book, in this book, in White Fragility, she talks like that our feelings are more about us than they are about them. But at the time that I had these feelings, I felt that my feelings were outrage and absolute, not really ashamed because of it, but it was like something that I didn't know about. I had no idea of the amount of bad justice that's out there in terms of Black people. I've had very little contact with with Black people in my life. And so it's not, you know, this was a whole new thing to me, that this whole, and so I'm dealing with my feelings, trying to see, okay, how should I have reacted to that? And how should I react to it in the future that is different? Because it evidently, this is part of my racism, is my reaction, and it's more about me than about them. And I'm just struggling with that kind of how do I react sort of place to be. It all began with that book, and with some of the things that have happened recently in the news and on TV. And I find myself, horrified, absolutely horrified. And but yet I do not feel like that is aimed, that is as an excuse to me. I feel like it's something that is empathetic. And
yeah,
I think, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Liz, Libby.
Somebody go ahead.
Liz.
I was going to say, Marty, I understand your response. I get that, because I get these overwhelming feelings of how wrong we have gone, how far we've gone, and how painful that is, that as a white person, that I'm part of that at some level. And Just Mercy was an amazing, I saw the film, I didn't read the book, but that level of responsibility as a white person for the terrible injustices that have been done against people of color, it just has been horrific. And so I should cry. I should cry, because it's so painful to know that I am responsible for that, as well as many others. But still, it is something to grieve over. It's to grieve over the lives that were damaged, and to grieve over how all of our families as white people at some level are responsible, and the history of that. And so, yeah, this is not about whether the Black people need us to cry. This is really about what kind of grief we need to go through in order to get us to a place where we can say, okay, I've done that. Now I'm ready to move on and see if there's some action I can take.
Mm-hmm.
And I need that.
Amen.
I think that's the thing, yes. Elizabeth. It's not that the feeling is wrong. We should grieve that. Partially because part of what we're grieving is that how we have profited from the racism around us has nothing to do with the values we profess as Christians. Okay, the Christian values of love and one humanity have nothing to do with how we have applied that in America. We should grieve that. But I think that your daughter's point is probably that that's not enough, because we've grieved before. Have we moved and changed things? Because that's what right now, this moment, I think is asking of us. Will we be courageous enough to do more than just grieve?
And also, where is the appropriate place to grieve? The author, of this book, she's talking about a situation where she goes into workplaces and helps to teach, forgetting the word for it, but teach white people about what it means, when we say certain things, we do certain things, what it means to a person of color, and to think in a way of fairness. When somebody's crying in a work situation and it interferes with the interaction in such a way that it can't go to the kind of healing place it needs to go to in the work situation, that's different than when we're watching something that's really profound, or we're talking with a friend about it and feeling awful because, we have participated in it by virtue of not having changed it. And so I think it's the situation that she's speaking to people in is different than individuals And I have to say that at some point she does say, we should talk among ourselves, read books and so forth to understand the Black experience and not ask people of color. But at the same time, I think that it's really important to be able to be friends with people of color and to be open to hearing what it's been like and how it is for them. And that's the hardest thing. It's so much easier and it's painful in a movie or a book too, but it's really the most challenging to hear how my friend, 25 years, was repeatedly impacted by racism that he encountered in his daily life. Or to see the kinds of things I saw. There was a Black young talented graffiti artist, this was in the 80s in New York City, who was murdered by transit cops. And I knew that he was murdered, and it wasn't just the arrest had gone awry, because there were several officers, 4 or 6 of them, who couldn't manage to put this person under arrest without killing him. And so it was just obvious. And, and then I had a Japanese husband, and he, it's like, I thought that racism wasn't as bad for Japanese, and in some ways that's true, but still we'd have trouble getting a cab on when we tried to hail one in New York City, if they saw that he was there with me. I had to sometimes stand out there and hail the cab. It just things like this. It just, every day when you get what the picture is, what it's really like, it's different than reading it in a book. There are these huge atrocities, and the 13th is a movie I want to see to understand even more. But there's that part about really becoming interconnected with people of color, and finding ways simply to reach out and be friends.
Yeah. And much of it comes down to things that we profess anyway, that God loves, the red and yellow, black and white, they are precious. And we've sung that since we were kids, right? But are we living as if that's true? Are we truly being in that space where we're allowing that person to be as loved as I like to be loved? Or am I accepting something from me that isn't being given to someone else? And that takes some very hard work. In the second chapter, the good, bad binary, I want to go to that. I think that dualism is one of the great evils of Christian thought processes, because it's easier, but it's not how life is. Right? Good, bad binary is about just saying certain things are good, certain things are bad. And it's not that simple. It is about being in a space where we don't take easy answers, we take better answers. So she talks about 2 different ways that we do that. First of all, there's the ways that we claim color blindness, where we say essentially, I don't see color. Which usually means I ignore what's uncomfortable to me about color. And second of all, it's that where we claim to value diversity, color celebrates, she calls it, but it makes it so that we're not right now being active in doing something, because I've already arrived, I'm free of, I'm not thinking about, but it makes it so that we become passive rather than active in dealing with this. So which of those probably describes you better? Do you tend to be more colorblind or color celebrate? Which one is your dysfunction in this area?
Well, I found that it was much easier to relate with people of other nationalities, colors, whatever, in the San Francisco Bay Area, because it was such a diverse area. And the neighborhood where my son grew up once he hit middle school was about 30% white, 30% black, 20% Asian, and 20% Latino. So we were always had a big diversity there. And I remember a young friend from Chile. And we were walking down the street one day, and she wanted to change the side of the street because, oh my God, there's a black man coming our way. And I held on to her and I said, we're not going to cross the street. And a few years later, I saw her and she was working, and she said, I said, well, let's go to lunch when you get off for lunch for work. And she said, no, I'm going out with my coworkers. And I watched, and about half her coworkers were black. And so she had met people who were black, and she found they're just people. And so she was very happy going to lunch with her coworkers. And I thought, yay. I was very happy to see that. But it's easier when you have diversity all around you.
It is easier. But that's part of the issue.
Yeah.
How many have most of your life grown up pretty white bound, right?
Mm-hmm.
Pretty typically with folks that are looking more like you, with a few token color, but have had too much of yourself around you. And that's been America of the past. It's definitely not America of the future, as all minority populations are rising.
Mm-hmm.
And are we going to continue to try to cross to the other side of the road, or do we embrace this and see it for the power that it can be? Paula.
I think at times it has been easier for some people to get to know a person of color or a gay person and think, oh, I really like him, I like her, but they're different. You know, they could still have very judgmental feelings and thoughts about everybody else that might be that color or that sexual orientation. And somehow, you know, that knowing the person, like, well, he's really a great guy, you know?
Unlike all those others like him.
Yeah, and then and it's like they don't hear what they're saying, I don't think.
Right.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly what we have to figure out. At one point she said, am I actively seeking to interrupt racism in my context and in myself? How is it that I am recognizing that right now I'm somehow speaking or acting in a way that is propagating the wrong view of, example of all of this? But that takes awareness. That's the first big step, is awareness and openness to not be down on ourselves because of that, but to empower ourselves because of that. And one of the things that gets in the way is whenever we say, I'm not racist. Now, we can do that in a lot of different ways. Sometimes we do it because we can say, well, they're much worse than me. How many know at least somebody who's much worse at it than you? Okay? And so you can always say, that's where the problem lies. And you're right about that. It's not helpful that you're right about that. Because it makes it so that you put all the blame there instead of honestly dealing with what you still have to do. How do you continue moving forward and changing and growing and making the world around you change? She goes through a series of different things where she says, oh, no, let me do this first of all. I'm going to give you a thing when I get off that I want you to just look at periodically. And it's really the last part of chapter 4. Here's I put it on a sheet of paper and it looks like this. I'm calling it a fierce and honest examination of conscience. Okay? And it just says a lot of different things that are here that we often do. How is it that you do these things? And I don't want you to do, well, I'm pretty good at that. I want you to say very honestly to yourself, how is it that you're not good at it? How is it that you still go into defensiveness rather than truly stepping into the situation? How is it that you're not understanding, but just disagreeing? All right. And what through the next week, I'd like you to put this somewhere and just periodically through the week, take the time to really think deeply about that, so that you're as much as possible in that space of being most honest and most open to what can happen. Because the more we fight it, or the more we sit without asking the questions, the deflecting behavior, the more we miss out on the opportunity to reflect on our behavior. And that reflecting is what's going to change us. Don't take simple answers, I guess is what I'm saying. Because that's what leads to a perpetuation of racism rather than anti-racism. Anti-racism has to be the opposite, where we very strongly look and think about it. And I love the part where she talked about, it's not about, okay, she talked about differential treatment. And she said people need to be treated differently. All of us need to be treated differently. You know, Judy's a much harder person to deal with, so I have to treat her with kid gloves. I'm just kidding.
You better.
We have to be in each individual relationship in a way that we are honest with that relationship. And then she goes on to say that the differential treatment is not in itself the problem. The problem is the misinformation that circulates around us and causes our differential treatment to be inequitable. So that as I'm dealing with people differently, am I trying to be equitable, which is very different than equal. Okay? You know the difference between equal and equitable? I love the picture of the three kids trying to look over the fence into the baseball game. Have you seen that? One's a tall kid, one's a medium-sized kid, one's a small kid. And in the first picture, only the tall kid could see over the fence. So they put each of them on a block. So now the tall kid is way over the fence, the medium-sized kid can see over, and the small kid still can't see. Okay? In the third picture, they take the block that the first kid is standing on and moves it to the third kid. First kid can still see over because he could when he began. Now the third kid can also see over the fence. Right? That's equitability. It gives each person what they need to be able to truly do things. But then I like the other thing that happened where the next picture showed the fence was gone. Right? What do we do to work with each person in the best way possible? In personal relationships, but also corporately. How do we do that? But we can't. Go ahead.
I like the list that she gives for each of the first and second ways in which well, like the one set as to color blindness and the other is as to color celebrate. I like the list of the ways in which they're expressed because some of them sound really familiar.
Absolutely.
And what I get is those are all well and good that either I've done something or whatever. It's on a list, but that is not an excuse for either my thinking.
That's right.
Necessarily promote my understanding and my change and my greater ability to be an anti-racist person.
Yeah.
I laughed at the one that says, "I'm not racist, I'm from Canada."
That wasn't one of the ones I was mentioning, Jude.
I'm on page 71, which is where I saw 77.
That's where we are.
Yeah.
And any of us can easily say, those people are much worse than I am. That is not helpful in any of this conversation. Right? The conversation is about us and what we're doing. and trying to be honest about how I can and need to change and become better.
Yeah, when Wendy talked about San Francisco, I remembered how frightened I was of Chinese people when I lived in San Francisco. I was fine with black folks. Had lots of friends and coworkers, but the Chinese people scared me for some reason. I guess I didn't interact with any.
Uh-huh. And the hard part about that fear, whenever we have that kind of fear like that, Judith, is that the first thing we want to do is run away.
Yes.
Yeah.
And study after study has shown that when you're fearful of something, running away always increases your fear.
Yes.
And you know what you have to do is, if you're fearful, move towards. Right? And so if in all of this area, our tendency is to run away, we're exasperating the problem rather than helping to solve it.
So going back to your question, Jim, about not being colorblind or being color celebrant, I think I'm both.
Yeah.
Because the color blindness is having been totally, I'm just so amazed at my ignorance about how our whole society was built on the disequality. It was designed this way.
Yes.
And I've been oblivious to that. So in terms, in that way I've been colorblind, or, just not recognize that. But then when I have had interactions with students and with faculty members and now neighbors who are Black people, I do celebrate that.
Mm-hmm.
I hope I don't name drop or that my entry into something else or pretend that I'm anti-racist, but I do celebrate those connections that I have with those folks. And so I'm guilty on both counts.
The problem is not that we shouldn't celebrate what we've done, because we've done some remarkable things. We are so much better than what we used to be. It's that if we allow that to make it so that we stop,
Right.
if we allow that to make it so that we declare racism isn't present any longer, because our friends of color can't pretend that. And if we continue to pretend that's true, then we're really not being honest in our relationships with them, as individuals or as a society. And that's where the celebration becomes wrong. They need us to be present in today's reality.
I also heard a Black man say, I don't want you to count yourself as an ally until you've done 3 to 10 years work on yourself.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, I don't know if I've got time for that, but I guess that's my job.
The good news is, Judy, it doesn't necessarily mean that you go to one more parade, one more march. It might mean that you talk to Uncle Harvey when he says that stupid thing that he says every Thanksgiving dinner. Say, stop that. That joke is not a good joke for us to listen to any longer. That might be some of the most important work that you do with the people that are around you, which might mean that suddenly they get mad at you.
There are actually people, probably a lot of people in this country now, saying there needs to be another civil war.
Yeah. And the hard part about that, Kristen, is that many of those are people who would consider themselves very good Christians, that think that everything has to fall apart before Jesus is going to come back and save us all.
Oh yeah.
Right? It's poor second coming theology. And so they're actually, I believe, trying to break America.
I do too.
And we have to be better and more optimistic than that.
Well, I just ran across something that had just come across the news a few minutes ago, and it's actually a huge surprise. It's a photo collage created by the Moms Club of Rancho Santa Margarita in Orange County, California. You can't get much more right-wing and white than Orange County, California. And after the killing of George Floyd, it reads, "We stand with all moms and pledge that racial discrimination will stop with our kids." And I thought, oh, wow, we are changing. There is a movement afoot.
Orange County elected a Democrat, you know, in 2018.
It sure is changing from when I lived out that way.
Yeah.
And at least part of what this chapter is about being, both these chapters are about us really being honest and not allowing simple courses to be our action path. That we choose to be in the discomfort of much more difficult and challenging paths. The good news is we've got 3 or 4 more weeks to solve that in this class itself. And so we'll have that figured out by the end of that. The whole issue, right?
Well, Jim, can I just bring up one more big news thing that happened this week? It was on Monday. And remember the couple that was defending their $1 million home with guns? Yes. Well, they are going to be federally indicted.
Good.
And the district attorney is Black. So I thought that was a very interesting news item. You know, you can have guns, you can be armed, but you don't wave them at people and threaten people.
Yeah.
Well, the other part of that, though, is that they have been incorporated into some of Trump's ads.
Yeah.
No kidding.
Oh, boy.
Yeah. There's a lot of work to be done.
I was just going to say that. There's a lot of work between now and November.
There is.
Yeah.
That's a lot of work for the rest of our lives, I think.
That's right. Yeah. And probably for our children's and our grandchildren's lives. It's an ongoing thing. I believe that it is at least part of what most of the religious thrust in the world has been about, is how to be in better relationship. You know, religion itself, the word means to tie our hearts back together. And racism at its core is about building walls between us. So what we're doing is trying to do the core of what this whole spiritual journey is about. It's about finding ways to fight the walls and draw hearts together. Thank you for the work you're doing so much. We're going to do the next 2 chapters, and I will send you a couple of different things. I told you about the fierce and honest conversation. I'm sorry, examination of conscience. I'm also going to send you this ad. It's about a thing that Judy gave to me. The UCC Church has a series of workshops over the next 3 weeks about working for racial justice and solidarity with the Black community. If you'd like to do that, I will send this to you so you can click in and sign up for that.
Jim, is that what went out on the email? Because it didn't say who was sponsoring it or anything, who's doing it.
It's United Church of Christ sponsoring that.
Okay, and who's talking? I mean, what is it?
I do not know how to answer that. You, go to the registration and maybe that will give you some ideas.
Okay.
Actually, there's no information on the registration, and I hunted around and actually communicate with Melissa as well. And what I learned is that there's you can go to the Facebook page for the United Church of Christ, and they have a little bit of information on it, but not a lot. It just mainly gives the days and times.
It's Arizona Faith Network has a lot to do with this program.
Oh, okay.
Arizona Faith Network is PCIC in the Phoenix area. And my good friend Joe who helps us here as well. He kind of is our lead organizer in that, and so it's a good organization that it comes out of, all of that. Okay, so I'll send all that to you.
Thank you.
Thank you
Very much, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye, Siri.
Bye. Bye.